Hello, y'all. Welcome back. This is going to be the final lecture of the class, number 32. There's been a bunch of this one. All right, this is Policy Evaluation and Public Participation by Carolyn Hendricks. We're just going to kind of skip over the intro and move into section 32.2, the role of participation in policy evaluation. There's an argument to be made that without evaluation input or some sort of input, right, from citizens or from stakeholders or from the target of a policy, whatever it might be, the policymakers might really never know how to really truly define a problem or understand whether a policy is effective or not, right? Many times the policymakers themselves are not the users of policy, right? Um, okay, there's often been a sort of client satisfaction approach, right? Like opinion surveys, polls, this sort of thing, that sort of, I don't know, treats citizens like consumers, and is looking at like economic benefits and stuff like that, right? Which we've talked about has been a pretty heavy focus of the Western model for a long time. And this can be sort of a problem, right? Because sometimes citizens aren't necessarily looking for an economic outcome, or they're just looking for an improvement in their overall life or their community or whatever it might be, right? And sometimes you can't necessarily put a number on that. Let's see. Sometimes these evaluations, even though they're getting input, like a bureaucracy or whatever might be sending out user surveys, sometimes it's just about following the process, right? Like they're not actually looking to actually change anything, or they don't really even know how these answers would lead to a better change, right? Like there can sometimes be issues inside of the evaluation process itself. Many times think tanks are using their own evaluations, right? Because sometimes there are, like we discussed, concerns about whether the bureaucracy or the organization that manages the logistics, say, of a public policy, whether they're fairly representing how well they're doing. And so sometimes think tanks will use their own sort of evaluations and critiques. And so think of like the Better Business Bureau or the Chamber of Commerce. There's also some really famous, what would you call these think tanks about just democracy itself and the functioning of governments, which is interesting, like Freedom House and others like that. And you also have to remember that sometimes you're getting input from both ends, even if it is completely citizen based, right? Uh, there are potentially users and non users out there who are critical of the program, even though they don't have anything to do with it, right? And so, like social safety nets, right? Um, Oftentimes, there are high levels of what would you even say, sort of input about how social safety nets are just all bad, right? And then on the other side, you often have people pushing for just huge expansions of safety nets, um, and so the input you get depends on who you ask sometimes, and so you got to be careful about that kind of thing as well. Okay, so what does this generally look like in practice, right? I think the most popular is probably these like user surveys, where I don't know someone who say is using VA benefits or Social Security benefits or whatever it might be. They'll take a random sampling of the users themselves and send them an opinion poll, that kind of thing, right? Or you might get surveys that get sent out to organizations and NGOs that are involved in that particular like sub realm, right? So we'd be talking to the AARP about senior citizen policy and Social Security and that kind of stuff. We'd probably be talking to the National Resource Defense Council about environmental questions, and these sorts of things, right? You get targeted input of sort of stakeholder groups, right? And that can be sort of what I was just discussing now, but it can also be like going to academics. It can be those who are maybe community, what do you call those? Community organizers who are involved in a particular subfield, right? Like maybe if we're talking about hunger and distributing food resources, right? It was really big during COVID. And so you might go to all of the community leaders as the stakeholders and figure out, what can we be doing better, and logistics, supply, all this kind of stuff. Third, they do a lot of focus groups, right? You'll get either experts or just random people to sit down and discuss for a couple hours, and they'll pay them lunch, and usually give them a couple $100 or something like that, right? Expert roundtables, those are generally happening all the time. I don't really know sometimes who's listening to them. Public hearings, which can be contentious and a little bit wild. For those of you who have done my like extra credit for my intro courses, where you go to a government meeting and write up a little paper and take a selfie. A lot of times I'll get some really interesting comments about the paper and how things just went crazy or awry, or something really weird happened, or yeah, it's funny. So public hearings, like, they can be good, and I think philosophically they're good, but they can get strange, right? You also get things like public comment periods by law. So if we're going to make a change to a major bill or something like that, they'll have like a 60 to 90-day window where the public can comment on like I don't know, an open source like government post board, right? And then they'll maybe dig through all that stuff. I don't really know. Um, but a lot of laws will have a window where the public gets to sort of put in input. Okay, Section 32.4, citizen surveys. So these, you got to be careful with these, right? If you don't do a survey right, it's just going to tell you wrong things, right? And so the survey science is a little bit of science and data management and econometrics modeling, and then a little bit of magic. So it's hard. Opinion polls and stuff are really difficult to get right sometimes. Um, Sampling bias can be very misleading. If you don't sample your population correctly and you get a very different than the average sample, then you're going to get a different from the average answer. We've talked about before, it's really difficult to get some people to respond. So think about policy related to like immigrants or the very poor or homeless or criminals or formerly like imprisoned people, drug addicts or victims of like horrible crimes. It can be hard to get any of that list to talk, and more. I'm sure there's more on there, right? Because of fear of government, fear of institutions, inability to like even access people, right? If they're homeless, like how do you keep a discourse or like a longitudinal data set? I don't know how that would even work. And so, yeah, these things can be pretty difficult sometimes, especially with some of the more difficult policy that you try to implement to change people's lives, right? There's a third question about like, what does satisfaction mean? Like, okay, here's a 7-point Likert scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. What exactly are we even looking for? What is the context around that? Some of this can be really hard. And then how does that actually lead to better policy outcomes or policy changes, et cetera? Again, that's pretty ambiguous sometimes. Public meetings and hearings is section 32.5. We talked about these can be really contentious. They're set up oftentimes in a very strangely like competitive way with like the leaders on one side versus the population on the other side, and that can, I mean, even just that sort of context can make things go strange. They can get a little out of hand sometimes, and I mean, that's your right. Like, go be mad at your politician. I'm okay with that. But yeah, it can sort of break down into just anger and I've seen some like town hall meetings the politician will just like flee, or yeah, I mean it can go weird. And you wonder sort of how is that helping to implement new ideas, right? Sometimes it feels like it's like, oh, you have a complaint, but this is how it is, and let me tell you why it has to be that way, right? And that can get frustrating too to citizens. Some potential positives of these meetings are that they send information to media, policymakers, etc. And this is one way that really dictatorships can go horribly awry. Is that we call it the dictator's dilemma, right? If you're not getting feedback from your citizens, and everyone's scared to say any sort of critical thing about your government, and that goes all the way up the chain. This fear that's built into your society. There is a very rosy picture at the top about what your society looks like, um, and then things can just sort of explode, right? And that's kind of what happened with when the wall fell. It's what's happened in a few sort of coups and revolutions, and so yeah, the dictator's dilemma can be at least assuaged in a bit through, of course, public feedback, right? It can help to either support or shame your officials, right? And that can be good pretty much either way, I think. Like if your official's not doing very well, then they maybe should be shamed, right? And if they're doing well, they should be supported. It sets the agenda, or it helps to set the agenda, right? By putting in some citizen feedback about, where does this need to go? What do we need to focus on? It can help to delay decisions. So we've been seeing this a lot lately with AI data centers and even with what is it, Customs and Border Patrol trying to build warehouses to house immigrants during the deportation process, right? And a lot of citizen groups have gone to their local representatives and thrown a fit, basically, and said like we're going to slow this down, and oftentimes at minimum it slows it down. Sometimes the project still goes through, um, but sometimes it doesn't, right? And it gives time to be more thoughtful about like how is water going to be used, how is electricity going to be used, how are these things going to affect utility bills and property values and property taxation and all kinds of stuff, right? Like there's a lot behind just building a new gigantic facility, right? Um, Oh, and it can help to form networks. When you're out in public and you're at one of these town hall meetings or something, maybe you'll see someone who had a really cool comment or idea or thinks the same way that you do a little bit. And maybe all get together and network and maybe some sort of, I don't know, like a civil society grows out of it, right? Which can always be a good thing. Not always, right? Because things like the KKK and other hate groups can also be considered civil society under sort of the rules of Putnam. So let me just be clear about that. Okay. Section 32.6, Innovative Forms of Public Engagement. I thought this was a cool little spot, and I actually added one. First, they say we can consider citizen juries, right? And this was cool. They'll pick like 20 random citizens. I'm guessing this is a Euro thing. I've never really heard of this, but they'll pick 20 random citizens. They'll put them up, and they'll just sort of have a forum for a few days or for a week, and they'll all sort of discuss with experts and policymakers and each other, etc. I thought that was pretty cool. Now, how helpful? I'm not really sure, but I'd like to learn more about it. Number two, multiple level of analysis in surveys. I think this is important. We need to get citizen surveys, the target population surveys, local governance experts, maybe NGOs, bureaucrats about how all this would even be changed or worked out. All of this sort of stuff. And then probably maybe international analysis of how other countries do this thing, whatever it might be, and what are good approaches and what are bad approaches, right? All right, the one I wanted to lead or ad was dual use government employees. And there's not a lot of this out there, but I think there's something behind it. It could be useful. And I was thinking like community leaders or on the ground implementers, right? So they've built community locally, right? They help with the subfield that we're talking about. I don't know what it might be. But let's say um, um, pregnant women and then post pregnant for the first year, right? There's a lot of focus on that in our sort of healthcare system and others, right? And so we're talking about maybe a doula or a nurse, okay? They're out in the community, right? They're very local. They've built relationships and trust and all of these sorts of things with users of a particular policy, right? And so not only could they help to implement policy on the ground because they have greater knowledge of your local community and they have trust with local community members, but they can also give real and helpful feedback to the policymakers and the bureaucracy about how this could be improved in real life, right? And so, again, like nurses or doulas, right? Or if we're thinking about maybe food assistance leaders, or if we're talking about food assistance, maybe it's the local NGOs and the local sort of religious leaders like pastors, imams, um, oh man, the rabbi, there we go. Maybe your local, and there would be some touchiness about sort of right the Establishment Clause and whether the United States can do that sort of stuff. But we do know that they could just sort of funnel things like food and stuff like that through those organizations and build a relationship with our community leaders and our religious leaders in our community, and then get like true maybe feedback from them about how this could improve. Um, okay, that's all I have. I really hope you liked the class. This was a really difficult one, um, but this is important, really important stuff. And basically, like no matter what you do in political science, no matter how you see your future with your degree, you're probably going to need to know a lot of how this policy stuff works, right? And because you're going to want to influence it probably in some way, right? Or you're going to be building it yourself in some way, right? So thank you for putting up with me. This was a huge class. I really hope I see you all in the future, and I hope I see you in my Middle East class. So it's filling up incredibly fast. So if you need an overage, let me know. Thank you so much. Have a great day.